Do you want to be part of something bigger? At Siemens, we use AI to transform the everyday. Our engineering solutions drive innovation and change. We're leading in technology and building a sustainable future. Join Siemens and make an impact to transform the everyday. Apply now and be part of something extraordinary. Visit siemens.co.in/careers.
Today on CityCast Houston, budget cuts, censoring textbooks, culture wars, and teacher shortages are just a few of the issues local independent school districts are facing as we head back to school. So, to learn more about what's happening in our school districts, I'm bringing on Lehrer-Small, who covers education for the Houston Landing, and the Houston Chronicle suburban education reporter, Elizabeth Sander, for a roundtable of stories to know this school year. It's Monday, August 12th. I'm Raheel Ramzanali, and here's what Houston's talking about. Elizabeth, Asher, welcome in. It is a beautiful day. Back to school week is here. How are you doing, Elizabeth?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
How about you, Asher?
Doing great. So glad to be back on the podcast.
All right. So I'm going to ask you this question first, Asher, because you are a returning guest. So I'm going to put you on the spot and I'll give Elizabeth some time to think about this. If you had a kid, which ISD would you pick to send your kid to for school?
Wow, that is a big question. And I know it's one that a lot of families grapple with. As many of you know, I cover Houston ISD, which has seen a lot of changes in the last year or so. I've also gotten the chance to walk through a lot of classrooms, and I've seen some really great teaching. I would be happy to put my kids in HISD if I had kids.
Okay.
Still going to be years down the road, but yeah, that's where I'll fall.
Okay. How about you, Elizabeth? You're covering all these suburban independent school districts, so you have experience with everything that's going on, and you know about HISD, obviously. Which ISD are you picking?
Well, for me, I think it would be a decision that many families make. It's probably based on location. I probably would send my kids to HISD as well, just based on where I would want to live and the area of Houston where I currently am. But that doesn't mean that I think poorly on the other suburban districts. But yeah, I think I would choose HISD for location.
And the reason I'm asking this question is because, look, HISD has been in the news a lot regarding state-appointed Superintendent Mike Miles, his policies that have been implemented, his decisions, staff turnover, and all this stuff, right? And it seems like it's very negative, but there are some positives there as well. We're going to talk about this throughout today's episode. So let's start with this one first, the budget. I think this is one of the big things that is going to impact a lot of students, parents, teachers, and ISDs. School districts across Houston had to make some tough choices when they passed their budget this year. HISD slashed $500 million. Federal dollars from the COVID-era relief funds are also ending, so all budgets will be impacted. Asher, let's start with HISD. How are these budget cuts going to show up in classrooms and campuses?
Sure. Yeah, it's an important question. And as you said, Raheel, $500 million the district had to cut from its budget in June. So there are certainly going to be ramifications of that. I kind of want to talk about the staffing and how that's been impacted by the constrained budgets and also, by the takeover over the past year. So as many of the listeners probably know, the state of Texas appointed a new superintendent and school board to lead HISD last June in 2023. So this past year when they made the budget cuts, as you said, that was because there have been declining enrollments in HISD for years. Well before the takeover, there's been COVID stimulus money that is just drying up right now. And then the overhaul program that the new superintendent, Mike Miles, has instituted has been really expensive. So when they made those big cuts, they didn't say exactly what positions were going to get cut. So that's been an open question for a while. But then just before the start of the school year, we learned that there's going to be 750 fewer teaching roles in HISD and also 1,400 fewer central office employees. So to put the teacher number in perspective, that brings HISD's total number of teachers down from around 11,400 last year to 10,000 640-ish this year. So that's around a 7% drop. Or if it's distributed across all schools equally, around 3 fewer teachers per school, although we don't know exactly how those cuts are distributed. But it's really important because this is really our first window into the direct impact of these budget cuts, because 500 million sounds like a huge number, but we didn't really know how that was playing out in classrooms. And the superintendent and the district had said they were going to keep cuts away from classrooms, but this teacher number appears to slightly contradict that. Now, at the same time, the district argues that this is really just a right sizing of the number of teachers in line with the number of students, because HISD has been losing students for a long time. But that's how the numbers are playing out. Now, just a little bit of background here as well. You've probably heard a lot about turnover in Houston ISD this past year. And there were a lot of teaching roles to fill. The Houston Chronicle reported about a week ago that the teacher turnover rate was above 40%, which is really, really high. It's about twice what's typical in HISD. The district has told me that they contest that number. They say it's really around 30%. And when you exclude the teacher roles that got eliminated, around 24%. So I personally have not gotten those data, so I can't really provide my own analysis there. But what I can tell you is that HISD says it had to hire for about 2,800 teacher positions this summer, and it's filled almost all of those slots. So even with all the turnover, they've brought in new teachers to fill those positions. But of those roughly 2,800 teacher roles they hired, about 850 are teachers who lack certifications. So there's a lot going on there, but we can just suffice it to say there's been a huge shakeup on staffing, and budget constraints have been a big part of that. Now, in the context of everything, this is something worth noting as well, that the new superintendent, whose policies have been highly controversial, is also probably feeling really vindicated right now because the district received really good scores on the state standardized tests. So we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one thing that Superintendent Mike Miles kept reiterating in our interview that we had earlier last week, that the staff vacancies are almost filled and results are showing up. So, and we'll see how these budget cuts will impact HISD when we start getting test results at the end of this school year and see if that did impact. Now, Elizabeth, let's go to some of the suburban ISDs, because Spring Branch, Cy-Fair, those are just two that jump to mind right away. The budget cuts are impacting a lot of ISDs. What are you seeing in the suburban ISDs?
Yeah, I would say, the suburban ISDs are definitely going to be feeling some of these budget cuts. Even though none of the districts have as large of a shortfall individually as HISD, cumulatively, it's about $900 million of budget shortfalls across the Houston area, which I think just goes to show, how deep those cuts are going to have to be. One thing that's, come across a lot in the last couple months is cuts to librarians. And I think that's something that has just really made parents and students and teachers even so frustrated and sad. For example, Spring Branch ISD eliminated all of their librarians in an effort to, address their budget cuts. Such widespread cuts to librarians haven't really happened before in the Houston area to this level. And then the next thing I would say also is we've seen some school closures, which obviously will impact a lot of families who, had a campus and now they're at a new campus. Spring Branch ISD had some school closures, and Aldine ISD also had some school closures. And so students who are starting school this week and next week, they may be going to entirely new campuses within the same school district. And so that obviously poses some, general problems as assimilation and kind of getting to know your new classmates and whatnot. And then the last thing that I would highlight for how the impact of budget cuts are going to be on students is there's some transportation changes in Cy-Fair ISD that I think a lot of families are really, really frustrated by. In order to, not cut as many teachers and librarians, the district had to make significant changes to their transportation program. And so school districts in Texas aren't required to provide busing within 2 miles of a school or for students that live within 2 miles of a school. But Cy-Fair ISD has really historically done so. And that's one of the reasons why, as a suburban district, parents are drawn to it because they can live close to the school, but also have busing. And so now they're moving to a hybrid plan where they won't have guaranteed busing for middle school and high school students that live 2 miles from campus, and they won't have guaranteed busing for elementary schoolers that live 1 mile from campus. And they're eliminating their late buses, which is going to severely impact sports and after school activities. So, I mean, it really does remain to be seen what this looks like on a day-to-day basis. But, I've heard sources tell me that, parents had bus stops changed within the last couple of weeks. Parents had a bus stop and then they didn't. So there's really a lot of confusion going into the school year. And Cy-Fair's first day of school is August 19th. So we will have to see what that looks like starting from day one. But yeah, that's a pretty big change that they've had to make.
And one piece of context as well that plays into all of this, we're hearing about these massive budget cuts across the entire Houston area, not just HISD, not just Cy-Fair, across much of the Houston area. And a lot of what that comes back to is the last legislative session. The legislators were sitting on this huge historic budget surplus in the ballpark of $33 billion. And a lot of people were hoping that some of that would get allocated to public schools, because public schools, a lot of them are facing shortfalls. And the last time that they increased the per student allotment to schools was in 2019. So we know there's been a lot of inflation since then, and the legislature did not allocate any money. So that's one of the reasons among many that a lot of these districts are facing a bind right now.
And they didn't allocate it because politics are being played regarding school vouchers as well. And politics in school seems to be one of the big topics right now. One listener, in fact, messaged us on Instagram, and he wanted to know what the heck is happening with Cy-Fair school board, because he is ready to leave the district because of the politics that are going on. Is that true, Elizabeth? What is happening out there in Cy-Fair?
Well, I will say I have heard this from parents before. I think there's been some real frustration with the school board this year. Obviously, in November 2023, they had their school board elections, and a couple new trustees won seats. And now the current, standing on the school board is what I've been calling a 6-1 conservative supermajority. So while school districts and school boards are generally nonpartisan, a lot of the trustees that are currently on Cy-Fair ISD school board have made their political views pretty clear, especially in the election and campaigning process. Some of them were backed by Senator Ted Cruz. And so I think you see, some political leaning. And a lot of these trustees came in with ideas of what they wanted to bring to the table. For one example is trustee Natalie Blasingame. She has been on the board for a few years now, but she was a fierce advocate of the chaplain bill. And she actually advocated on the Senate floor in support of that bill. And she is employed by a charter school that actually is the only school to hire a chaplain so far after the chaplain bill passed. And by the way, the chaplain bill is a bill that was passed in, I believe, 2023 that allowed school districts to hire a chaplain in their school building to serve in a role adjacent to a counselor. The bill was pretty vague and it didn't come with any additional funding. So most school districts chose not to adopt the policy, given that a lot of school districts in Texas already have robust chaplain volunteer programs. And some districts just felt like it was veering a little bit too far into, religious inclusion in the schools. And many districts weren't comfortable with that. But she really wanted that to be a part of Cy-Fair. And ultimately, the board, despite their political or potential religious beliefs, decided that it wasn't the best call for Cy-Fair ISD to hire a chaplain, especially given some of the budget constraints. And they have a pretty robust volunteer chaplain program. But they also made decisions to censor textbook chapters recently, which, really blindsided a lot of families. They took away chapters on topics such as vaccines, climate change, COVID-19, cultural and religious diversity. And so a lot of families felt like that choice really didn't represent what they, believe, and really kind of alienated students who might not be a Christian or might not have certain beliefs about vaccines and climate change. And in some instances, if you take too much of that out of the curriculum, you're not even teaching the TEKS. So the text essential knowledge and skills. So I think it's been a really rocky year in the district. There's a lot of conflict between families and parents, constituents, and the school board members. And I don't necessarily see that resolving anytime soon.
Asher, what about an HISD? Anything to watch out for this school year when it comes to the quote unquote school culture wars?
In HISD, the debates really are a little bit different. You don't see those same sort of debates that maybe you see in Sci-Fair in HISD among board members. But depending on who you ask, some people would consider the ongoing takeover in HISD part of the culture war. So it's true, of course, that the leadership in HISD right now was handpicked by a Republican administration and put into here in Houston, a mostly blue city without say from voters. But at the same time, the politics of the superintendent and the board, it's a little tough to pin down. It doesn't align clearly with either party's agenda necessarily. But at the same time, we've all seen just how controversial the program that they've put in place has been. Now, it doesn't necessarily look like banning a certain type of books or necessarily including religious concepts in classes, although there was reporting last year that the number of full-length books or novels included in curriculums was actually like a lot less in HISD. Now, the superintendent would say that's because he thinks that reading from passages is kind of the best way to align reading lessons with how kids learn to read. He wants to keep kids' attention. He doesn't want lessons to drag on. But that's of course generated a lot of controversy because I think many people, when you think of a reading class, an English class, you think of classic novels. So, HISD does have its fair share of these kind of debates, but has largely been spared of the more intense culture war battles.
Any other districts, Elizabeth, that we should be on the lookout for when it comes to the school culture wars?
A couple things to highlight. One thing that recently happened was Spring Branch ISD. Their board voted on a Title IX resolution because the president recently changed federal Title IX regulations, and that's caused some districts to feel confused. That ruling protects transgender and LGBTQ plus students. But of course, Texas state leaders have said absolutely no to that updated Title IX ruling. So it puts districts in kind of a rock and a hard place situation where they have to decide if they're going to, pass a resolution that supports the new Title IX or pass a resolution that supports their state leadership.
How would that play out? Like, give me an example of that. How would this play out?
I think one of the biggest things that came in the new ruling that I think some people were concerned about was protecting the ability of transgender students to use bathrooms and I think sports, we would say. So I think, in the Spring Branch Title IX discussion, trustees were talking about how Title IX was, created to protect women. And by giving rights to transgender students, somehow that was counteracting, protecting girls. And that's not necessarily the case, but I think that is the belief of many people who are on school boards in the area. So I do think, the impact of that could be wide-reaching. And also it could make transgender students feel further alienated by their own school districts and, feel like they're not protected on the same level. So while this is still pretty new, we haven't necessarily seen the direct impact of what that will look like on a day-to-day. I can definitely imagine that there could be some, emotional mental health impacts of not going with the new Title IX ruling. The other thing that I wanted to point out was that the Sci-Fair board recently voted to censor some textbooks, but I think that's one way where the culture wars are playing out, as we're speaking right now, because sci-fi curriculum instructors are still dealing with figuring out how to create new curriculum from scratch because 13 of their textbook chapters have been eliminated. One of the textbook chapters that was eliminated had a list of different religions and definitions to those religions. Another chapter that was eliminated talked about, how students might be able to help mitigate the harmful effects of climate change. So I think we're seeing a lot of these ideas that have, always been around in the culture wars becoming a little bit more, we'd say, concrete in how school boards are deciding to address whether or not they want those ideas being taught in their school districts.
Elizabeth, let me ask you, when a district changes textbooks like that, are they reprinting textbooks or are they just blacking out pages? I've always been curious because my daughter is in the 4th grade. She doesn't have textbooks yet. And I don't think there have been many issues with textbooks yet in Fort Bend, at least from my knowledge. So how does that work?
Well, I think this actually came about because certain trustees and parents who had read the proposed textbooks asked for certain pages to be deleted, but that was not possible. So it came back to them that if you want to delete a section or a couple pages from a textbook, the whole chapter has to come out. So that basically would mean that the teacher wouldn't be able to provide, their online textbooks. So for students, it's pretty easy to change chapters like that, but it definitely changes the teacher's curriculum and what the instructional materials they're allowed to use are. So students would have to receive supplemental instructional materials. So let's say other textbook chapters or, a self-created textbook chapters if the district chose to do that. And then those students would have that chapter in place of the one that came next in the textbook.
Gotcha.
So it's not necessarily easy, but it's a little bit complicated.
Okay, I thought teachers were out there ripping out textbook pages. Like, I was so confused.
They just get their Sharpie out and start blacking out 50 pages in a row.
Yeah, it looks like a document request, right? Like when you get it back from the government, everything is just blacked out. That's what I thought it would look like.
Yeah, no, they're not redacting the textbooks. Not here.
Asher, let's go to new rules or new faces. Are there any new policies or rules that parents, students, or teachers should know about entering this year?
Yeah, the biggest one in HISD this year, and, hopefully parents already have gotten this memo, but that the school year is starting a lot earlier. So August 12th, first day of school, and that's about 2 weeks earlier than it was last year. So that's because last year the district made the decision to extend the school year, started earlier. And so the thing that I'm going to be watching is schools' air conditioning, their HVAC systems. Last year, at the beginning of the year, HISD schools reported about 1,600 cooling issues over the first 2.5 weeks of school, according to some maintenance records that I obtained. And so that can be really extra bad. And in some schools that rely on what's called T buildings or temporary buildings, these are kind of like trailer-like structures that are used as classrooms when schools have more students than can fit in them. And there's about 1,400 of those across HISD. So lots of students are sitting in these classrooms that are often getting way too hot when the temperatures are high. And now it's the same thing, but with 2 extra weeks of August heat. So we all really have to hope and pray that it doesn't get too high into the upper 90s and hundreds. The superintendent, Mike Miles, has said he really does expect that there will be similar problems this year as last year with the heating issues. So there are temporary coolers all set to go. And the bigger issue here, what this comes out to, is this question of improving facilities through a bond, which is one of the bigger questions in HISD right now. A few days before the start of the school year, the board voted to officially put the bond on the ballot in November. So voters will be able to vote yes or no in November. But the background is that it's been 12 years since HISD has passed a bond. Typically, urban districts do that around every 5 years to just keep up regular maintenance on their facilities. So what that means is that there are a lot of classrooms with infrastructure issues, rain that comes through the roof when it's raining out, or AC that kind of goes in and out intermittently. So what's on the ballot now is actually the biggest school bond in Texas history. And it's real controversial because a lot of people, they acknowledge that these upgrades are needed, but there's a lot of frustration with the new administration. So voters are going to be able to decide on that in November. But
yeah, that is definitely something to watch out for, how that AC issue is going to play out. And by the way, that bond is roughly $4.4 billion. All right, Elizabeth, let's get to what's happening out in the suburban ISDs. Any new rules or new faces that we should know about?
One thing I wanted to highlight is some library policy revisions that are happening in some suburban districts. Districts don't necessarily have to change their policies in the passing of House Bill 900, which is called the Reader Act, that was passed. It went into effect before the last school year, but some school boards have waited and are deciding to make some changes to their library policy going forward. So Fort Bend ISD is in the middle of kind of reworking their library policy. They actually proposed a policy that would have given the superintendent sole authority over which books could be in school libraries in the district, which the superintendent said he didn't necessarily want because he had a pretty big job already. And that's a pretty hefty task to have to take on. So that policy has gotten back to the drawing board. And so in the Fort Bend ISD board meetings in the future, they probably will propose a new redlined library policy for, how books can show up in the library and what, appropriate content for their books would be. And then Sci-Fair is also going through a similar process where their board has proposed a policy that would have given their board members final say over any books that could appear on district shelves. And that obviously caused a lot of animosity among constituents in that school district because many of them feel like that should be up to the librarians. Although with half the workforce of librarians that the school district previously had, they're definitely going to have to figure out who should really be in charge of that. But most parents feel like having school board members in charge of the books in a classroom isn't necessarily the best way to go about it. So those are two things I just wanted to point out. Other districts might take similar action in the coming months, so we will have to see what happens.
What is a redlined library policy?
Good question. A redline library policy would be a policy that's been edited. So let's say every school district has their local library policy, how they acquire books, what kind of books are appropriate, who has the sole authority over removing books. And many districts have, comprehensive policies in place for, let's say, if a parent has a concern about a book, they can file a claim or a complaint, and then, there's usually a committee that will take a look at that. So those library policies generally outline all of the ways that the library books appear on school shelves. A red line policy is just one that's been edited. So often it's the proposal that hasn't yet passed that will be released to constituents and board members to take a look at and see, what's on the drawing board for the new policies.
Elizabeth, what is happening in Humboldt ISD? Because I'm so confused about what's happening. Is there going to be a new superintendent? Is there going to be a new face out there? What's happening?
Well, I am so glad you asked because I think many people have the same question. I have spent a lot of time in Humboldt ISD over the past few months, reporting at every single board meeting. There's always a development in what I would call the kind of mire that developed from a Title IX complaint against the athletic director or the former athletic director who is the superintendent's husband. The most recent development is that the board proposed to terminate their superintendent, Elizabeth Fagan, on the eve of her 9th year in the school district. So at the moment, she has time to appeal that decision, and then it would go into a process that could last from 60 to 125 days, where if she does appeal the decision, and her lawyers have told me she will appeal the decision, then she gets to hold a public hearing with the Texas Education Agency. If that goes in her favor, she might return to her post as superintendent. But in the meantime, as while that process is going on, they do have their acting superintendent who is currently at the helm. His name is Roger Brown. So he is the superintendent that will be in charge of the district going into this new school year. He's been in his post since May, when the board voted to put Dr. Elizabeth Fagan on leave. And, this process has been going on for 15 months now at this point, and the board is just split.
Wow.
Really split on what to do. They are in a 4-3 split on pretty much every vote about this issue, and they are in complete disagreement about why Dr. Elizabeth Fagan was placed on leave, about terminating her at all, and many other things stemming from that original Title IX complaint. So it's just been a lot to watch, and it's cost the district over $500,000 at this point.
Whoa.
So we will see if the superintendent does receive a buyout at some point. That will likely also be, over $1 million. So it's just costing the district a lot of money in a time where they probably don't have that much money to spare. So.
Wow, that is a lot right there. Okay, final one. Let's get to our most overlooked story. And this could be with HISD. It could be with charter schools as well. We haven't talked about them. If there's anything happening there you want to bring up, Asher, let's start with you. What is your most overlooked story that we should all know about as we head back to school?
Yeah, thanks, Raheel. For my most overlooked story, and it's almost funny to call it overlooked, but I'm going to bring up the remarkably positive student test scores this past year in HISD. They really haven't gotten that much attention yet, and it's partially because those scores and those results are only just beginning to come into focus fully. I reported on preliminary STAR scores, so the state standardized test, last June, and we have state accountability ratings, so these A through F scores that schools get, those are coming out August 15th. But the takeaway was that HISD, after this really tumultuous year, led the region in the growth of the number of students that scored at the meets or exceeds standards benchmark for state tests. So that was really welcome news for a district that, for a long time has seen long equity gaps. And some of the schools that have been for the longest time historically underperforming did some of the best in terms of growing the level of student achievement. And so there are always going to be people who question how much a standardized test is going to measure student learning. There's really valid questions about, maybe students' test anxiety, or whether the tests, especially if they're considered really high stakes, could impact the type of ways a teacher caters their lessons to align to that test. But overall, it's really good news that we're seeing increases in the number of students scoring, at the level they're supposed to be. So what I'm really curious about going forward is what explains this change. It's a really dramatic uptick. I've been covering education for about 4 years now, and before Houston, I was covering it from at a national outlet, and you really don't see this sort of dramatic improvement that often. So the explanation that Superintendent Miles gives is that these scores are just a byproduct of his overhaul, that teachers are improving their quality of instruction, and that this model works for students. Now, over the past year, as I spoke to students and parents, really their perspectives were a lot more mixed on it. Some of them felt like actually the model wasn't even really always being fully implemented. Like, teachers were only using the recommended methods when there were district or school observers in their classroom, but the rest of the time just kind of carrying on as usual. So now I really want to go back to those parents and students and ask, what's their take on seeing these scores go up? Because we know that, at least from preliminary results released by HISD, a lot of campuses increased their A through F ratings by a lot. So we saw a big decrease in the number of D and F schools in HISD, and a big increase in the number of A and B schools, including some schools that went all the way from an F rating to an A. So it's really dramatic changes, but I'm looking to see if we can get at what explains this. And we know it's really important, not just in Houston, but across the country, because people are watching the Houston ISD takeover to see what sort of results come about last spring. HISD held a conference where there were administrators from the Denver School District, from Seattle School District, from Little Rock School District who attended to learn more about what's going on in HISD. So really, if this is successful and we're seeing some early signs that are encouraging, it could have really huge stakes, not just for Houston, not just for Texas, but for education across the country. So I'm hoping to get behind the curtain, kind of understand this a little better and bring readers with me so folks can follow along at the Houston Landing or all the outlets across Houston that are covering this.
Elizabeth, how about you? What's your most overlooked story?
Well, I'm not sure how overlooked this is, but it's definitely something I'm looking at going into the upcoming legislative session. But, I cover suburban school districts, but I also cover private schools and charter schools. And obviously, there's a lot of debate about school vouchers and if legislation on school vouchers will pass in the upcoming legislative session. Governor Greg Abbott has said that he has the votes to pass, some kind of school vouchers bill. And I recently did a story that looked into some data that was, released a few weeks ago that said that more Texans support school vouchers than you might think, which is not what I've been hearing on the ground, but it really put it into perspective of how parents and families are feeling about their local ISDs, especially, in underserved communities. And so I think that's going to be something to keep a close eye on, and whether or not the legislature will actually go forward with a vouchers bill and what that will look like. Arizona is a state that does have a vouchers program, but they have a very, very large deficit because of it. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not something will pass and what the effect will be on the ground. So I'm going to continue to report as much as I can about how families are feeling about the possibility of school vouchers in Texas.
All right, we'll keep tabs of that reporting. Thank you both for joining us. And I know you didn't get a summer break, but it's back to school for y'all as well with your reporting. Elizabeth, Asher, thanks. And I can't wait to read everything you covered throughout the school year.
Thanks, Raheel. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
That was Houston Chronicle's suburban education reporter, Elizabeth Sander, and Houston Landing's education reporter, Asher Lehrer-Small. You can read all of their work with the links in our show notes. Now, we got a lot of updates and info in this episode, so if you have a friend or family member whose kids are headed back to school, send them this episode so they can get up to date with what they can expect this coming year. That will do it for today. I'm Raheel Ramzanali. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new. And sorry, I'm going to be clearing my throat a lot and sniffling. I'm just congested like crazy today.
Same boat. I'm just getting over a cold. That's why my voice sounds really nice and raspy today now.
Yeah.